Well, soccer's world governing body FIFA has chosen Saudi Arabia to host the 2034 Men's World Cup. The decision has been criticized by environmental campaigners as well as human rights groups, with Amnesty International saying it will put many lives at risk. Saudi Arabia is the only country to put in a bid. Norway was the only country to abstain from the process, arguing it undermined FIFA's own good governance regulations. Well, let's get more on this. We are joined by Tracey Holmes, a Professorial Fellow in Sport at the University of Canberra. Tracey Holmes, good to have you on the program once again. Now, you've argued that there is a predictable rush to look at Saudi Arabia's hosting in 2034 through the prism of only human rights, and that there are two important factors that we are missing. What are they?
Well, I think what got lost in the reaction overnight, and a lot of it has been through that prism of human rights, as you mentioned, what we lost was the fact that the 2030 FIFA World Cup was also announced, which was a joint bid between Portugal, Spain and Morocco. Let's not forget to celebrate that. But also the fact that there is substantial change that has already occurred inside Saudi Arabia over the past 5, 6, 7 years, with the promise of more to come. And I think when we've seen the similar reaction that we had to the Qatar World Cup in 2022 and 10 years of negativity, human rights focus very clearly in the mainframe in Western media, we forgot to actually look at some of the broader issues that were happening and the changes that happened and the legacy that is brought about through the attention that an international event like the FIFA World Cup brings.
Yeah, you were mentioning that Saudi Arabia has been making some changes. What are they?
Well, I think there's been some incredible changes. Anybody following what's gone on there, particularly with regard to gender recognition and the rights of women being given the ability to drive, now working in pretty much every single sector in the workforce where that didn't happen in the past. We're seeing a lot of the social structures being relaxed. And you have to remember that this is out of a very conservative religious culture. And they need to be very careful about the way these sorts of relaxation of the laws take place. But it has been happening, and women have noticed a significant improvement. That's not to say that there are not human rights issues. And I think one of the points I was making was that I'm absolutely okay with talking about human rights issues in any country, including our own. But when we look at these sorts of events in that part of the world, we tend to not look at anything else that's taking place. It's a very fine lens that we apply, but we don't do that to ourselves when we host major events.
Well, of course, there are human rights issues in most places that we know of. Of course, some groups do say that, on the migrant workers front, that this bid presents a direct risk to the lives of construction workers, given how many stadiums are being built. I think it's about 15 for the 2034 World Cup. And given what we saw in Qatar, and the authorities there have acknowledged that about 500 workers had died. So there are legitimate concerns there when it comes to the welfare of migrant workers, isn't it? And that brings up the whole argument about sports washing from Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely, but the whole argument about sports washing is that people are using, from different parts of the world that are not like us, using sport to wash their reputation. But I think that completely ignores the fact that these changes we've already spoken about, with women being given equal access to work opportunities now, to being able to drive, to having social relationships with each other, going to entertainment venues, which they weren't allowed to do previously. On the workers' front, we saw significant changes inside Qatar. They brought in a workers' labour court. They changed the very strict rules around labour employment. And they continue to make progress in this regard. And a lot of people would be hoping, including the International Labour Organisation, that these are the sorts of changes that can also be brought about because of the international focus that these big sporting events bring. So it's not to say that it's all bad and nothing changes. It's to say, let's shine this light so that the positive changes can be brought about, and that the potential of hosting a major event, a mega event like the FIFA World Cup can have long and lasting impacts for a whole variety of people in a cross-section of the community in Saudi Arabia.
And do you think Saudi Arabia's bid was boosted by their own league, where, you've got some of the world's biggest stars that are currently playing in that? Ronaldo is the biggest name there.
I think one of the other things that we forget to look at with a lot of these events is that we think that these events come out of the blue, whereas, as you say, they've been developing their own league. There is also football for women now. Women are playing in schools. There are girls playing in schools because this was part of their Vision 2030, which was designed, a decade or more ago. I'd need to check on the exact year, but it was a long time ago. And this was their plan, their strategy heading towards 2030. So this was one more element inside that vision. And a lot of that was to try and address massive obesity rates, massive diabetes rates inside the country. 63% of the country, and you're talking about 36 million people, are under the age of 30. So they needed a real kind of shot in the arm to try and interject in this massive health issue that they had. Sport was one way of doing that. And what you need to do first is develop an interest in sport, which is why they've gone so hard after trying to attract many of these big events.
Tracey, I do want to get into the politics of FIFA here because the former Socceroo, Craig Foster, he argues that the FIFA boss, Gianni Infantino, is increasingly supportive of the Middle Eastern bids because of huge amounts of sponsorships that FIFA can generate there, and that Infantino has engineered a process to place Saudi Arabia in a position where they are the only reasonable candidate. What do you make of that assessment?
Look, I think obviously there are changes in the world. We've seen it happen first with the Olympics and then with the FIFA World Cup and other major events that are a tier lower than that. We saw it with the rise of China. Suddenly they were bidding for world events. Now we're seeing it in the Middle East because of the amount of disposable income they have, the sovereign wealth fund that they're using to sponsor and buy many of these athletes and sporting events, and also insert themselves into various leagues and ownership of different teams around the world. So yes, of course, there's a lot of money there. That's where the money is. But when the money used to be in the West, it wasn't a problem that nations in the West made bids for these sorts of events. So I think it's just a natural cycle as we're seeing shifts and turns in the complete geopolitical world.
And indeed, now, of course, before we get to Saudi Arabia, you mentioned this earlier. Now, there's 6 nations who will be co-hosting the 2030 World Cup. Now, how is that all going to work out, 6 nations? Because the next one is, I suppose, a coalition of the US, Mexico and Canada.
Yeah, it's interesting. It'll be very interesting to see how the next one goes because we know also with the change in government in the USA that there's going to be some natural tensions we expect to play out between Mexico and the USA and Canada sitting up north. But that's going to be incredibly difficult for people to be able to cover because you're flying here, there and everywhere, not to mention the teams who will be playing in certain places, having to fly elsewhere. Once you get to the knockout stages, semi-finals, final, it requires a lot of moving and across national boundaries. When you talk about 2030, you've got 6 countries involved. Part of the reason why South America was included in that is because it's the centenary of the World Cup. And so it's the 100-year celebration. So pretty much it'll be focused in Portugal, Spain, Morocco, but they also wanted to bring in South America because of the huge influence South America has had on international football since the very beginning.
Yeah, that sounds like quite the logistical challenge there. Tracey Holmes, thanks very much once again for your insights.
Thanks for having me.